Okay, so I'm going to talk about understanding the relationship between compassion, which is very important for us as human beings, and evolution, which provides the background and the science for who we are physically and ultimately psychologically. But it's an interesting... Oops, is that supposed to... there we go. Okay, so we're faced essentially with two competing views of humanity. On one hand, we've got, literature, art, movies, religion, telling us that what's most central to being human is our capacity to love and to act compassionately. Okay. But on the other hand, we have evolutionary theories, and some of you may have taken some of this at university where I work, in either psychology or in biology, but it's mostly in psychology that they talk about human behavior. And here we find that evolutionary theories apparently tell us that we are fundamentally selfish. Okay, so now the reason for this is natural selection. So natural selection is a core principle of evolution. Basically, we don't evolve if we don't survive and pass on our genes. If we don't survive and pass on our genes, we go extinct. Okay? However, there are limited resources out there, and this leads to competition. So if I don't grab the food and grab the stuff for me and my offspring, somebody else will grab it. I'll go hungry and fail to reproduce, and my line will go extinct. So compassion, basically, as we understand it, is the urge to give away my stuff. So from an evolutionary point of view, this raises a question: how can this creature survive in a competitive world? So the problem with explaining compassion from an evolutionary perspective is you have to explain how compassion could have evolved in a selfish world. Okay, there are actually multiple theories that address this. So, and they're all, valid theories. So the first theory is, well, these are just broad categories. There's 4 broad categories of theories that explain compassion and evolution. The first one is that there is no compassion, that we're simply deluded when we talk about it. We imagine that we're giving the homeless person some money on the street because we care about them, but actually we just want to look good to people around us, something like that. The next class of theories is that compassion is a meme. So a meme is an idea. So basically this idea is that compassion is cultural, not biological. So it's an idea that we have, we can learn about it, we can behave according to it, but it's not biologically in us. It's not in our DNA. We're not born with it. That's another class of theories. The next one is that compassion is a spandrel. So in evolutionary terms, a spandrel is an evolutionary mistake, that things develop as a byproduct of something else. So we evolving something to do with our mind, and compassion was just some sort of bizarre mistake that sometimes fires. So yes, we are compassionate, but it's this sort of strange add-on that we got somehow. And the last one is group selection. So in this one, the idea is that compassion does have a use in evolution, which it makes us much better team players. We care about other people in our group and we cooperate with them so that we can defeat other groups. So the ultimate purpose of compassion there is to allow our group to defeat other groups. Okay, so there is still competition. Okay, however, there's no scientific evidence for any of these theories. Okay? Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, you can't dig up a fossil of compassion. You can't dig up a fossil of selfishness. So there's no record. Also, we currently do not have the ability to look inside people's heads and see if they are being truly compassionate. We don't know how to do that. So there's no evidence for these. They're based on evolutionary arguments about what makes sense. Like from an evolutionary point of view, these are all possibilities. So this raises an interesting question. Is it possible to create an evolutionary story that compassion, not selfishness, is the more fundamental motivation. I don't think anybody's ever asked this question until now. So we'll look at this. So how would you do that, though? How could I do that? I mean, these theories are all well thought out, so we have to find some sort of angle here. So basically, all theories about compassion and evolution define selfishness and compassion in the same way, using the same model. Now, this model, again, there's no scientific evidence for this model, and the model is not culturally universal. It is not the case that everybody in the world agrees on what compassion is. There we go. Okay, so this is the model, and it should seem fairly familiar to us because it is our modern Western model that we have in our culture. We have two states, and they're often portrayed as a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder. One is selfishness, which consists of a motivation where we care about ourselves that results in a behavior. We help ourselves. And the other one is compassion. The motivation is caring for others, and the behavior is helping others. Okay, so that's our familiar model. Here's an alternative model. So the Buddhist model is probably the most well thought out and pervasive alternative to the previous model. Okay, we have 3 motivational states instead of 2 motivational states. So in Buddhism, attachment is a very important concept. So attachment basically means you want something, or you desire something, or you desire to avoid something. So you've got attachment to self, or I'm just going to call it attachment self. So attachment self, where the motivation is caring for yourself, and the behavior is helping yourself. Okay? Then we've got attachment other. Here the motivation is caring for another person, but it's still attachment. So like you can imagine, people care about their children. They want them to succeed. And they care about your friends and your relatives, things like that. And the behavior is helping these others. Okay? You desire for them to do well. Now, there's a third state, which I've called undifferentiated compassion. Here, and this is a separate motivational state. These are all separate motivational states. And the reason this is a separate motivational state is it's said to feel differently. Feel it. So here the motivation is to lower suffering. And there's no target for this. It is just simply you perceive suffering and you want to lower it. So the behavior could be helping others or helping yourself, depending on where you see the suffering. If you see suffering in yourself, you would help yourself. If you see suffering in others, you would help others. So here we've got 3 motivational states and 2 behaviors. Okay, so there's an extra motivational state here. Okay. Now, it's interesting because if you were going to make a prediction about this third motivational state, it makes an interesting neural prediction, which is that there should be parts of your brain that don't understand whether it's you or somebody else, that are undifferentiated, that don't make that distinction. And actually, very recently, in scientific terms, very recently, 2004, there was the discovery of mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are neurons that, or systems of neurons that fire in the same way, regardless if it's you who's doing something or if it's somebody else who's doing something. So in other words, there are patches of your brain that don't understand the difference between you and somebody else. Also, mirror neurons operate on emotions. They operate on other things, physical things as well too. So sense of balance, like if you see a waiter who's almost falling over, then you sort of like feel nervous as though you're almost falling over. If you go to a movie and you see a very sad scene, you might start crying, even though it's not you on the screen. So this is what we believe are the actions of mirror neurons. They don't understand that it's not you. So some interesting neural stuff going on with that. Okay, so now we have this other way of understanding selfishness and compassion. and a little bit of neural stuff to back it up. Okay, but does it make sense from an evolutionary point of view? Can we tell an evolutionary story? Okay, so I'll try and do that, and hopefully you'll think it makes sense. So this story, though, will start not with all creatures being selfish. They'll start with all creatures being driven by undifferentiated compassion. Now, how can you have that? Okay, well, actually, it makes sense. Because for simple creatures, like the clam here, undifferentiated compassion will result in them helping themselves, but not in helping others. In order to help others, or to be motivated to help others by undifferentiated compassion, you have to understand that they are suffering. And that actually takes a fairly big brain to do that. If you don't understand, or a reasonably big brain, if you don't understand that others are suffering, then undifferentiated compassion will only lead you to help yourself, because you feel suffering, stop it. You feel suffering, you stop it. Okay? And that actually makes sense from a biological point of view, because it's very, very simple. So there's no difference between starting with undifferentiated compassion and starting with selfishness. They both result in the same behaviors, but they're not the same motivation. Okay, now, once you get to more complex creatures, then you run into a problem. Because now, we've evolved sufficiently to understand that other creatures are suffering. Now, this does create a natural selection issue, because now I might give away all my food to a competitor, and that would be bad for me. So we need something. I mean, actually, it's interesting at this point, because evolution actually at this point predicts more or less that we would evolve something like the attachment system. Okay? And this is my most popular slide almost. But basically, from an evolutionary point of view, once we start being aware of the suffering in others, then it's to my advantage to help me with my suffering before I help a stranger with their suffering. So attachment self makes sense, because basically what it's doing is it's boosting my attention to me, saying, more suffering here, okay? Now, attachment other also makes sense, because from an evolutionary point of view, it's to my advantage to help my offspring. It's also to my advantage to help anybody who's related to me, because that promotes my gene pool, and that's known as kin selection in evolutionary theory. So, also, it's to my advantage to help people who will help me, to help my friends, to help members of my tribe, or whatever. That's known as reciprocity. It's also a principle in evolution. And from that, you get attachment other. Okay? So, evolutionary theory, if you start with undifferentiated compassion, evolutionary theory more or less gives you the rest of it. Okay, so I'm way ahead of time. Okay. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? Well, first of all, evolution does not necessarily say that we are fundamentally selfish. You can use evolutionary theory to argue that we are fundamentally compassionate. There are a number of theories I mentioned. Which one's right? Mine? One of theirs? Well, the thing is, we don't know. We don't have the ability right now to tell. Hopefully in the future we will. Which theory is more likely to be right? Well, I think mine is, but we really, again, we don't really have the ability to measure too many of these things. However, I will say something about the theory that I've presented, which is it is consistent with a huge amount of the human experience looking at art, movies, history, religion. So if that counts as evidence, then I think this is more likely to be right. So the take-home message here is that if you want to believe that compassion or love is the most central thing to being human, then go ahead, it's fine. It is both evolutionarily, scientifically, completely valid. Thank you.